The sound of her own heartbeat was the loudest thing Maria Santos had ever heard, not the distant rumble of enemy vehicles approaching through the mountain pass, not the whispered prayers of terrified villagers huddled in their homes, not even the metallic click of her rifle as she checked the chamber for what felt like the 100th time that night, just her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird desperate to escape. What transforms an ordinary person into someone willing to stand alone against impossible odds? What makes a 23-year-old woman clutch a weapon she barely knows how to use and refuse to abandon her post when everyone else has fled? The answer isn't courage, as most people imagine it. It's something far more dangerous and unpredictable. It's the moment when fear stops being about survival and becomes about protecting something more precious than your own life. This is the true story of one night that changed everything. A night when a young woman's so-called madness became the thin line between salvation and slaughter. Maria Santos never imagined she would become a soldier. Born in the small mountain village of San Rafael, nestled high in the Andes where the air was thin and life was simple, she had always been known as the quiet girl who helped her grandmother tend the small general store. Her hands were soft from counting coins and folding fabric, not calloused from holding weapons. Her biggest worry had been whether the weekly supply truck would bring enough rice and beans to last through the rainy season. But war has a way of finding even the most peaceful places. The conflict had been brewing for months in the valleys below. Government forces battling rebel groups, each side claiming to fight for the people while the people themselves suffered in between. San Rafael had remained untouched, too small and remote to matter to either army. The villagers had convinced themselves they were invisible, that their isolation was protection. Maria's father, Carlos, was one of the village elders who believed this fiction the longest. A carpenter by trade, he had built half the homes in San Rafael with his own hands. He understood wood and nails and the simple satisfaction of creating something lasting. Politics and war were abstract concepts that belonged in the distant capital, not in his mountain sanctuary where children still played soccer in the dusty square and women still gathered at the well each morning to share gossip and concerns about the weather. The first sign that their isolation was an illusion came on a Tuesday morning in late September. Father Miguel, the village priest, was conducting his usual morning mass when young Diego Hernandez burst through the church doors, his face pale with terror. Diego worked as a messenger, carrying mail and supplies between San Rafael and the larger town of Esperanza in the valley below. He had just returned from what should have been a routine trip. "They're gone," Diego gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "Esperanza is gone." The congregation turned in their wooden pews, their morning prayers forgotten. Father Miguel stepped down from the altar, his weathered hands gripping Diego's shoulders. "What do you mean, gone? Burned? The whole town?" Bodies in the streets. The rebels came 3 days ago, and when the army came to drive them out, Diego's voice broke. They said everyone was helping the rebels. They killed everyone. The church fell silent except for the sound of Diego's ragged breathing and the soft weeping of Carmen Rodriguez, whose sister lived in Esperanza. Had lived in Esperanza. Maria felt the words hit her like physical blows. Esperanza had been their lifeline to the outside world. It was where they sold their crops, bought their supplies, where her cousin Elena had moved after getting married just last year. Elena, who was pregnant with her first child. Elena, who had written just last month about how excited she was to become a mother. The silence stretched until Father Miguel cleared his throat. "We should pray for the souls of our neighbors," he said quietly, "and we should prepare." "Prepare for what?" asked Carlos, Maria's father, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "War is coming to San Rafael." That afternoon, the village council met in the small community center. 12 men, all over 50. All desperately trying to find a solution to an impossible problem. Maria sat in the back with the other women and younger villagers, officially observers but realistically the ones who would bear the consequences of whatever decisions were made. The debate went in circles for hours. Some wanted to flee immediately, to pack what they could carry and disappear deeper into the mountains. Others insisted they should send emissaries to both armies, declare neutrality, offer tribute if necessary. A few hotheads suggested they should pick a side and hope their loyalty would buy protection. Carlos Santos stood up slowly, his carpenter's hands clasped behind his back. "We have 47 families in this village," he said. 132 people, including children. "We have no soldiers, no weapons except hunting rifles, no training in warfare. If armies want to fight over our village, there is nothing we can do to stop them." "So we run?" asked Manuel Vasquez, the village's unofficial mayor. "Where do we run to?" Carlos replied. "These mountains only have so many villages, and we've heard what happened to the ones that tried to flee. The roads are watched. Refugees are shot as spies or conscripted as soldiers. Running might save us, or it might deliver us straight into the hands of whoever we're running from." An old woman named Rosa stood up from the women's section. Rosa had lived through more hardships than anyone in the village, had buried 2 husbands and raised 6 children despite droughts, earthquakes, and the occasional bandit raid. When Rosa spoke, people listened. "My grandfather told me stories about the last war," she said. "The one his grandfather fought in, against the Spanish. He said the people who survived weren't the ones who ran and weren't the ones who picked sides. They were the ones who became ghosts." "Goats?" Manuel asked. "Invisible. Worthless. Too small to bother with. They hid everything valuable, scattered when armies came, returned when they left. They became nothing worth fighting over." Carlos nodded thoughtfully. "We could hide the food stores, scatter the livestock, make the village look abandoned when soldiers come through." "And if they decide to occupy the village?" Father Miguel asked. The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Everyone knew the answer. An occupied village was a dead village, one way or another. Maria found herself standing without consciously deciding to do so. Every eye in the room turned to her, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. At 23, she was one of the youngest adults in the village, and certainly not someone whose opinion was usually sought on matters of life and death. "What if we don't hide?" she heard herself saying. "What if we fight?" The silence that followed was different from the contemplative quiet that had greeted Rosa's words. This was the shocked silence of people hearing something they couldn't quite process. Manuel cleared his throat. "Maria, dear, we appreciate your passion, but as your father said, we're not soldiers. Neither were the people of Esperanza." Maria replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "But they died anyway. At least if we fight, we die for something. We die, period," said Joaquin Morales, one of the younger council members. "Fighting just makes it faster." "Maybe," Maria said. "Or maybe it makes them decide we're too much trouble and they go somewhere else." Carlos looked at his daughter with an expression she had never seen before. Not disapproval exactly, but something like recognition, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "You're talking about making a stand," he said slowly. "Here, in San Rafael. I'm talking about not dying on our knees." The debate that followed was heated and painful. Families argued with each other. Friends took opposite sides. Couples found themselves divided on the most fundamental question any community can face. Is it better to live as refugees or die as defenders? In the end, they compromised, which meant they satisfied no one completely but gave everyone something they could live with. They would prepare to scatter if armies approached, but they would also prepare to fight if scattering wasn't possible. They would hide their food and valuables, but they would also gather what weapons they could find and organize some kind of defense. It was Maria who volunteered to coordinate the defense preparations, though she had no more idea how to do it than anyone else. What she had was the same quality that had made her stand up in the council meeting, an absolute refusal to accept that their choices were limited to different ways of dying. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of frantic activity. The men worked on hiding places for supplies and creating escape routes through the mountain paths. The women organized the evacuation plans for the children and elderly. Maria found herself in charge of a task that should have been impossible, turning farmers and shopkeepers into something resembling soldiers. They had exactly 17 firearms in the entire village, 12 hunting rifles, 4 shotguns, and 1 ancient military rifle that belonged to Rosa's deceased son. The ammunition was limited and mismatched. Most of the villagers had fired a gun before, but only for hunting small game or scaring off wild animals. The idea of shooting at other human beings was as foreign to them as the idea of flying to the moon. Maria organized training sessions in the evenings after the day's regular work was finished. They practiced in a clearing outside the village, using bottles and cans as targets. The sound of gunfire echoed off the mountains, and Maria worried that it might attract unwanted attention, but the alternative was facing armed soldiers with no preparation at all. The training revealed harsh truths about their situation. Most of the villagers were terrible shots under the best circumstances, and these were far from the best circumstances. Their hands shook. They closed their eyes when pulling the trigger. They jumped at the sound of their own gunshots. Diego Hernandez, the young messenger who had brought news of Esperanza's destruction, couldn't hit a target the size of a dinner plate from 20 feet away. But a few of the villagers showed natural ability. Carlos, despite his age, had steady hands and good instincts. Joaquin Morales had grown up hunting and could hit small targets at impressive distances. Luis Gomez, a quiet man who raised goats, turned out to have ice in his veins and never missed what he aimed at. And Maria herself discovered something that surprised everyone, including her. She was a natural marksman. Her shots were consistently accurate, her hands never shook, and she seemed to have an intuitive understanding of trajectory and wind compensation that the others struggled to learn. When she held a rifle, something clicked into place. As if she had been born to do this thing she had never imagined herself doing. "You're wasted in that store," Luis told her after a particularly impressive display of marksmanship. "You should have been a soldier." Maria shook her head. "Soldiers follow orders. What we're doing here isn't about following orders." As the days passed, scouts reported increasing military activity in the valleys below. Both government and rebel forces were moving through the region, and refugees brought stories of villages caught in the crossfire. The pattern was always the same. One army would occupy a village, the other would attack to drive them out, and the villagers would be caught in between. By the time the fighting ended, there were rarely enough survivors left to bury the dead. The reports created a split in the village that grew wider each day. Half the families decided to leave immediately, loading what they could carry onto donkeys and mules, and disappearing into the high mountain passes where they hoped to find safety in remoteness. The other half decided to stay, either because they refused to abandon their homes or because they had nowhere else to go. Maria's family was among those who stayed, though it hadn't been an easy decision. Her grandmother was too old and frail to survive a trek through the mountains, and her younger brother Miguel was still recovering from a broken leg that hadn't healed properly. They were anchored to San Rafael by circumstance, as much as by choice. On the night before what everyone sensed would be their last peaceful sleep for some time, Maria sat with her father on the steps of their house, looking out over the village square where she had played as a child. The moon was full, casting everything in silver light that made familiar places look strange and dreamlike. "I keep thinking about your mother," Carlos said quietly. Maria's mother had died in childbirth when Miguel was born, and Carlos rarely spoke of her directly. What about her? She was fierce when she needed to be. Fiercer than anyone knew. I think she would have made the same choice you did, about staying and fighting. Maria leaned against her father's shoulder, breathing in the familiar smell of sawdust and pipe tobacco that always clung to his clothes. "Are we crazy for doing this?" Carlos was quiet for so long that Maria thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Maybe, but I'd rather be crazy than be nothing." They sat in comfortable silence, father and daughter, watching their village sleep under the stars for what might be the last time. Neither of them could know that by the next sunset, Maria would be standing alone with a rifle in her hands, facing an enemy that outnumbered her 50-1, refusing to retreat even when everyone else had fled. Neither of them could know that her supposed madness would become legend. The attack came at dawn on a Thursday morning, just as the first light was creeping over the eastern peaks. Maria was already awake, as she had been every morning for the past week, unable to sleep past the hour when danger felt most likely to arrive. She was standing at her bedroom window, rifle in hand, scanning the mountain paths for any sign of movement. She saw them before anyone else did. A column of soldiers moving up the main trail from the valley, their weapons glinting in the early sunlight. Government forces, based on their uniforms, though at that distance it was hard to be certain. There were at least 50 of them, maybe more, moving with the confident stride of men who expected no resistance. Maria's shout of alarm woke the entire village. Within minutes, the evacuation plan they had rehearsed so many times swung into action. Children and elderly villagers were hurried toward the escape routes that led deeper into the mountains. Young men grabbed rifles and took up positions around the village perimeter. Women gathered supplies and prepared to follow the evacuees if the fighting went badly. But something was wrong with the plan. The soldiers were moving faster than expected, and there were more of them than the scouts had reported. Worse, a second column was approaching from the north, cutting off the main escape route. The villagers found themselves trapped between two forces with nowhere to run and no time to reorganize. "We have to surrender," Manuel called out, his voice cracking with fear. "Put down the weapons and hope they show mercy." "Like they showed mercy in Esperanza?" Maria replied, checking her rifle's action one final time. The first shots came from the government soldiers, warning shots fired into the air, followed by an amplified voice demanding that the village surrender all weapons and submit to a search for rebel sympathizers. The terms were clear. Cooperation might mean survival. Resistance meant death. Most of the villagers made their choice in that moment. They laid down their weapons, raised their hands, and waited to discover whether mercy was possible. Even Carlos, after one last look at his daughter, set his rifle aside and joined the group of surrendering villagers. Maria did not. She had positioned herself in the bell tower of the small church, the highest point in the village and the one spot that offered clear sightlines in all directions. From there, she could see the soldiers advancing from both sides, could count their numbers and assess their weapons. She could also see the terrified faces of her neighbors as they knelt in the village square, hands behind their heads, waiting to learn their fate. "Maria," Father Miguel called from below. "Come down, it's over." But Maria knew it wasn't over. She had seen this scene before, in the stories told by refugees from other villages. The surrender, the search, the accusations of collaboration, the executions that followed. She had listened to Carlos and the other village elders debate the impossible choice between resistance and surrender. But she had already made a different choice entirely. She wasn't going to resist, and she wasn't going to surrender. She was going to hold her ground and see what happened next. The government forces entered the village with the methodical efficiency of soldiers who had done this many times before. They separated the villagers by age and gender, searched houses for weapons and supplies, questioned anyone who looked suspicious. Their commander, a thin man with cold eyes and lieutenant's bars, seemed more interested in establishing control than in finding rebels. Anyway, for a moment it looked like the villagers' surrender might actually save them. The soldiers were rough, but not immediately violent. They confiscated the few remaining weapons, took what food they wanted, and began setting up a temporary camp in the village square. It was an occupation, not a massacre. Then one of the soldiers found the bullet casings from Maria's target practice. The discovery changed everything. The lieutenant's cold demeanor shifted to something much more dangerous. Anger, mixed with paranoid suspicion. He began questioning villagers more aggressively, demanding to know where the rebels were hiding, who had been conducting military training, which villagers were secretly supporting the enemy. When no satisfactory answers came, he selected 5 villagers at random and had them tied to posts in the center of the square. Carlos was among them. "Someone in this village has been training soldiers," the lieutenant announced. "Someone has been preparing to fight against the government. Unless that person comes forward, these 5 will be executed as examples." Maria watched from her tower as her father knelt with the others, his hands bound behind his back. She saw the fear in the faces of her neighbors, the terrible calculation playing out in their minds as they weighed one life against 5, resistance against collaboration. She understood in that moment that surrender had never been an option. Not really. The soldiers hadn't come to San Rafael to find rebels or secure territory. They had come to send a message, and that message required blood to be believable. Maria raised her rifle and took aim at the lieutenant. Her first shot took him in the chest, dropping him instantly. The sound of the gunshot echoed off the mountains like thunder, followed by a moment of stunned silence as both soldiers and villagers tried to process what had just happened. Then chaos erupted. The soldiers scattered for cover, shouting orders and searching for the source of the gunshot. Some of them began firing blindly at windows and rooftops, while others tried to establish a perimeter around their fallen commander. The villagers threw themselves to the ground, screaming and praying as bullets flew overhead. Maria worked the bolt action of her rifle and acquired her next target, a sergeant who was trying to organize a counterattack. Her second shot was as precise as her first, and another soldier fell. From her position in the bell tower, Maria had advantages the soldiers couldn't immediately counter. Height, cover, and clear sight lines gave her the ability to pick her targets while remaining relatively protected. More importantly, she had something the soldiers lacked in that moment: absolute clarity about what needed to be done. She wasn't trying to win a battle or defeat an army. She was buying time for her neighbors to escape, and she was making sure that anyone who survived would remember what happened when soldiers came to San Rafael expecting easy victims. Her third shot disabled a radio operator who was trying to call for reinforcements. Her fourth took down a soldier who was moving to flank her position. Each shot was deliberate, measured, and devastatingly effective. The government forces, trained for conventional warfare and insurgent tactics, found themselves facing something they weren't prepared for: a single sniper who had nothing to lose and everything to protect. Their standard responses failed because Maria wasn't following any standard playbook. She wasn't trying to escape or establish a defensive position or accomplish any military objective. She was just shooting anyone who threatened her village, and she was very, very good at it. As the afternoon wore on, the psychological impact of Maria's resistance began to tell on the soldiers. They had lost their commander and several others to an enemy they couldn't see clearly or effectively engage. Every shadow could hide the sniper. Every window could conceal death. The village that was supposed to be a simple pacification operation had become a deadly trap. Some of the soldiers wanted to retreat and call for artillery or air support to level the entire village. Others insisted on rooting out the sniper through direct assault. But without their lieutenant, command structure broke down into arguments and contradictory orders. Maria used their confusion to her advantage, moving periodically to different firing positions and continuing to pick off targets of opportunity. She had no formal training in urban warfare or sniper tactics, but she had grown up in these mountains and knew every building, every sight line, every hiding place. The village that had been her childhood playground had become her fortress. As darkness began to fall, Maria realized she was running low on ammunition. She had perhaps a dozen rounds left, not nearly enough to hold off a determined assault through the night. But she had accomplished something important. Most of the villagers who were able to move had escaped during the confusion of the fighting. The ones who remained were either too injured to move or had chosen to stay and help with the wounded, including her father, who had been freed when the soldiers took cover and was now coordinating the evacuation of those who couldn't walk. The sound of approaching helicopters ended Maria's brief moment of satisfaction. The soldiers had called for reinforcements after all, and soon the village would be overrun by forces she couldn't hope to defeat. Her resistance had bought time and lives, but it was about to end in the only way it could, with her death. Maria settled into her final firing position and waited for the helicopters to arrive. She had 13 rounds left and a clear view of the landing zone the soldiers would use. If she was going to die, she would make sure it cost them something. But as she watched the helicopters approach, something unexpected happened. Instead of landing and disgorging more government troops, they opened fire on the soldiers in the village square. The helicopters bore different markings. Rebel forces had arrived to contest the government's control of San Rafael. What had been a simple pacification mission had become a three-way battle, with Maria caught in the middle of a firefight between armies. The rebel attack saved her life in the short term, but created an even more dangerous situation. Now there were two forces fighting over the village, and Maria was still trapped in her tower with limited ammunition and no way to escape. The villagers who remained were caught between competing armies, both of which viewed civilians as potential enemies. As night fell over San Rafael, Maria found herself facing the longest and most dangerous hours of her life. The battle for the village was just beginning, and she was no longer fighting just to protect her home. She was fighting to survive until dawn. The rebel helicopters circled the village like vultures, their searchlights cutting through the growing darkness as they hunted for government forces. From her position in the bell tower, Maria watched the scene unfold below with a mixture of fascination and terror. What had been a desperate last stand against a single enemy had become something far more complex and dangerous. The government soldiers, caught completely off guard by the aerial attack, scattered throughout the village seeking cover. Some took shelter in houses, others crouched behind walls and vehicles. Their organized formation had dissolved into chaos, with small groups of men trying to survive rather than complete their mission. The lieutenant's death had left them without clear leadership, and the surprise attack had shattered what remained of their unit cohesion. The rebels weren't landing immediately. Instead, they maintained their aerial advantage, using their helicopters to strafe government positions and prevent any organized resistance. Maria could see muzzle flashes from the aircraft's weapons, followed seconds later by the sound of automatic gunfire. The noise was deafening, echoing off the mountains and drowning out the screams of wounded soldiers below. But the rebels' tactics created a new problem for the remaining villagers. The helicopter attacks were indiscriminate, targeting anything that moved in the village square. Maria watched in horror as Carmen Rodriguez, the elderly woman whose sister had died in Esperanza, was caught in the open while trying to reach her grandson. The searchlight found her, and seconds later she was cut down by gunfire meant for government soldiers. The rebels couldn't distinguish between civilians and combatants from their aerial position, which meant everyone in the village was now a potential target. Maria realized that her neighbors faced the same danger from their supposed rescuers as they had from their original attackers. Liberation, it seemed, was just as deadly as occupation. A movement in the square caught her attention. Her father, Carlos, was crouched behind an overturned cart with Miguel, her younger brother, and 2 other villagers. They were trying to make their way toward the church, probably hoping to find shelter in the stone building that offered the most protection from both ground fire and aerial attack. But between them and safety lay open ground that was being swept regularly by helicopter searchlights. Maria made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. She began firing at the helicopters. Her first shot sparked off the fuselage of the nearest aircraft, without causing visible damage, but it got the pilot's attention. The helicopter wheeled toward her position, its searchlight blazing, and Maria found herself pinned in its glare like an insect under a magnifying glass. She could see the door gunner swiveling his weapon toward the bell tower, could see the muzzle flash as he opened fire. Stone chips exploded around her as heavy-caliber rounds struck the tower walls. Maria threw herself flat behind the stone parapet, feeling the vibration of impacts through the ancient masonry. The bell above her head rang discordantly as bullets struck it, creating an eerie musical accompaniment to the violence below. But her shot had accomplished its purpose. While the helicopter focused on her position, Carlos and the others made their dash for the church. Maria saw them disappear through the heavy wooden doors just as the aircraft's guns began chewing apart the bell tower around her. She had perhaps 10 rounds of ammunition left, and she was facing at least 3 helicopters, plus whatever government forces were still alive and fighting in the village below. The smart thing would have been to surrender or flee, to abandon her position and try to escape in the darkness. But Maria had moved beyond smart decisions hours ago. She was operating on pure instinct now, and her instincts told her that running would solve nothing. The helicopter attacking her position had to hover in place to maintain accurate fire on the tower, which made it vulnerable to ground-based attack. Maria waited for a break in the incoming fire, then rose and took careful aim at the aircraft's tail rotor. It was a difficult shot under the best of circumstances, nearly impossible under current conditions. But it was also the helicopter's most vulnerable point. Her bullet struck the tail rotor assembly, and the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The helicopter began spinning wildly, its pilot fighting desperately to maintain control, as the aircraft whirled like a deadly top above the village square. For a moment it looked like he might manage to auto-rotate to a survivable crash landing, but the spinning aircraft clipped the roof of a house and exploded in a ball of orange flame. The explosion lit up the entire village, casting dancing shadows on the mountain walls and momentarily blinding anyone who had been looking directly at it. Maria blinked away the afteridges, her ears ringing from the concussion, and tried to assess the new situation. The destruction of their companion aircraft seemed to enrage the remaining rebel pilots. Both helicopters began concentrating their fire on the bell tower, and Maria realized that her position had become untenable. The ancient stone walls were thick, but they wouldn't withstand sustained heavy weapons fire indefinitely. She needed to move, but leaving the tower would mean abandoning the high ground advantage that had kept her alive this long. A new sound cut through the noise of gunfire and helicopter rotors, diesel engines approaching from multiple directions. Maria risked a look over the parapet and saw vehicle headlights winding up the mountain roads from both north and south. Reinforcements were arriving, though whether they were government or rebel forces was impossible to determine in the darkness. The helicopter pilots saw the approaching vehicles too, and their behavior changed immediately. Instead of continuing to attack the tower, they began providing covering fire for what were obviously friendly ground forces. That meant the vehicles were carrying rebel soldiers, and Maria was about to find herself caught between aerial and ground assault by an enemy that vastly outnumbered her. The first rebel vehicles entered the village square just as Maria fired her 8th shot, taking down a government soldier who had been trying to establish a firing position in a second-story window. The rebels immediately began dismounting and taking positions throughout the village, their movements coordinated and professional in a way that the government forces had never managed. Within minutes, the character of the battle changed completely. Instead of chaos and confusion, the fight became a methodical clearing operation, as rebel forces worked building by building to eliminate the remaining government soldiers. The helicopters provided overwatch and fire support, but the real work was being done by infantry units that moved with the confidence of veterans. Maria found herself in an impossible position. The rebels controlled the ground around the church and were systematically advancing through the village. They would reach the bell tower within an hour, and when they did, they would find her with a rifle and ammunition that had clearly been used against both government and rebel forces. Her defensive position had become a trap, but leaving the tower meant abandoning her father and brother, who were still sheltering in the church below. Even if she could slip away in the darkness, she couldn't abandon her family to whatever justice the rebels might dispense to a village that had harbored government forces. Her choice wasn't between resistance and escape, it was between dying alone or dying with the people she loved. Maria checked her remaining ammunition, 5 rounds. Not enough to fight off an assault, but enough to make sure her death had meaning. She settled back into her firing position and waited for the rebels to come. The wait stretched longer than she had expected. The rebel forces were being methodical rather than hasty, checking each building carefully before advancing to the next. They were professionals who understood that haste led to casualties, and they were willing to take the time necessary to minimize their losses. It was a luxury that Maria, with her dwindling ammunition and exposed position, couldn't afford. As she watched the rebels advance, Maria began to understand something about the nature of warfare that all her preparation and training had failed to teach her. Combat wasn't about courage or skill or determination, though all of those mattered. It was about resources, ammunition, position, numbers, time. She had started the day with adequate supplies of the first 2 and overwhelming disadvantages in the last 2. Now, hours later, her position was compromised and her ammunition nearly exhausted, while her enemies had grown stronger and more numerous. The mathematics of violence were working against her, and no amount of will or accuracy could change that fundamental reality. A new sound broke through her thoughts. Someone calling her name from the church below. It was Father Miguel's voice, though she couldn't make out the words over the ongoing gunfire. The priest was shouting something urgent, and Maria realized that he might be trying to warn her about some new danger. She risked a look over the tower's edge and saw rebel soldiers approaching the church entrance. They moved cautiously, weapons ready, but they weren't firing. Instead, one of them was calling out in Spanish, demanding that anyone inside come out with their hands visible. It was a surrender demand, not an attack order. The church doors opened, and Maria watched her father emerge first, his hands raised high above his head. Miguel followed, limping on his injured leg, then the other villagers who had taken shelter in the building. They were searched quickly but not roughly, and Maria was surprised to see that the rebels seemed to be treating them as non-combatants rather than enemy prisoners. Father Miguel was the last to emerge, and Maria could see him gesturing toward the bell tower and speaking rapidly to the rebel commander. The priest was clearly trying to explain something, though Maria couldn't hear the conversation from her position. What happened next changed everything Maria thought she understood about her situation. Instead of preparing to assault the tower, the rebel commander called up to her directly. "Maria Santos," he shouted in Spanish that carried a distinct accent from the northern provinces. "I am Colonel Ramirez, of the People's Liberation Army. Father Miguel has explained your situation. We wish to speak with you." Maria almost laughed at the surreal nature of the moment. After hours of deadly combat, her enemy wanted to negotiate. But she had no idea what they might want to discuss, and she was painfully aware that surrender demands often preceded executions. "I'm listening," she called back. keeping her rifle ready. "You killed Lieutenant Vasquez and several of his men," Colonel Ramirez continued. "You also shot down one of our helicopters and killed 3 of our soldiers. Under normal circumstances, this would make you our enemy." "These aren't normal circumstances," Maria replied. "No, they are not. Father Miguel tells me you were defending your village against government forces who were preparing to execute civilians. He says you are not a soldier, just a woman protecting her home." The conversation felt like a trap, but she couldn't see what advantage the rebels would gain from deception. They already controlled the village and could easily assault her position if they chose to do so. "What do you want?" she asked. "We want to offer you a choice," Colonel Ramirez replied. "You can surrender your weapon and be treated as a non-combatant, or you can join our forces and continue fighting. But if you choose to surrender, you must do so now. My men are tired, and their patience is limited." The offer stunned Maria. In all her preparation for this day, she had never considered the possibility that she might survive it, much less that she might be recruited by one of the armies she had been fighting. The rebels were offering her not just her life, but a chance to continue the fight that had consumed her village. "And if I refuse both options?" she asked. There was a long pause before Colonel Ramirez answered. "Then we will take the tower by force and you will die. But you have already proven yourself as a fighter, Maria Santos. It would be a waste to kill someone with your skills and courage." Maria looked down at the scene in the village square, where rebel soldiers were treating wounded government troops and helping to organize medical care for injured civilians. Whatever else they were, these weren't the mindless killers she had expected. They seemed to operate under some kind of military discipline that included rules about prisoner treatment and civilian protection. But more importantly, she could see her father and brother standing safely among a group of villagers who were being given food and water by rebel soldiers. Her family was alive, her village was no longer under immediate threat, and she had accomplished everything she had set out to do when she first climbed into the bell tower. The smart choice was obvious. Surrender her weapon, accept treatment as a non-combatant, and try to rebuild whatever remained of her old life. The war would continue with or without her, and she had already done more than anyone could have expected from a shopkeeper's daughter who had never fired a shot in anger before today. But as Maria looked at her rifle, she realized that the woman who had climbed into the tower that morning no longer existed. The girl who had worried about rice supplies and helped her grandmother count change had died somewhere in the hours of combat, replaced by someone harder and more dangerous. Someone who had discovered she was very good at violence and wasn't sure she wanted to give it up. "I'll need to think about it," she called down to Colonel Ramirez. "You have 5 minutes," he replied. "Then we come up." Maria Santos sat alone in the bell tower, surrounded by empty cartridge cases and bullet-scarred stone, and tried to decide who she wanted to be when the sun rose. The choice would define not just her future, but the future of everyone who had witnessed what happened in San Rafael on the night when a village girl held off 2 armies and refused to surrender. 5 minutes to choose between the life she had lost and the life she might gain. 5 minutes to decide whether the woman they would call insane was the person she wanted to become. The bell above her head chimed once in the mountain wind, marking the passage of time toward a decision that would echo through the mountains for years to come. In the distance, she could hear the sound of more vehicles approaching, more soldiers coming to a village that had already seen too much war for one night. But for Maria Santos, the real battle was just beginning. The fight for San Rafael was ending, but the war for her soul had only just started. And as she gripped her rifle and prepared to give Colonel Ramirez her answer, she realized that she had already made her choice hours ago when she first refused to surrender. The only question now was whether she had the courage to live with the consequences of being the person she had discovered herself to be, whether she could survive becoming the legend that others would make of her story, whether the woman who had held the tower could find a way to exist in a world that no longer had any place for the girl she used to be. Outside, Colonel Ramirez was checking his watch and preparing to give the order that would end her 5 minutes of reflection. Maria Santos took a deep breath, picked up her rifle, and prepared to discover what came next in a life that had already gone far beyond anything she had ever imagined possible. The night was far from over, and neither was her story. Maria Santos descended the bell tower stairs with her rifle still in her hands, each step taking her further from the girl she had been and closer to the woman she was becoming. The ancient wooden steps creaked under her feet, a familiar sound that seemed to belong to another lifetime. When she pushed open the heavy church door and stepped into the square, she entered a world that had been transformed as completely as she had been. Colonel Ramirez stood waiting for her, flanked by 2 soldiers but with his own weapon holstered. He was younger than Maria had expected, perhaps 35, with the lean build and watchful eyes of a professional soldier. But what struck her most was the way he looked at her, not with the dismissive glance men usually gave to village women, but with the careful attention reserved for someone dangerous. "You've made your decision," he said. It wasn't a question. Maria nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what decision she had made. "I won't surrender my rifle." "And you won't join our forces?" "But I won't be disarmed." Colonel Ramirez studied her for a long moment, taking in her torn dress, her dirt-stained hands, the confident way she held her weapon. Around them, rebel soldiers continued their methodical clearing of the village, but Maria noticed that several had paused their work to watch this conversation. Word of the tower sniper had spread, and she had become something of a curiosity. "You understand that this creates a problem," the colonel said finally. "My men have orders regarding armed civilians in contested areas. You cannot remain in this village as a non-combatant while carrying a weapon." "Then I won't remain in the village." The words surprised Maria even as she spoke them. She hadn't consciously decided to leave San Rafael, but somehow the decision had made itself. The village that had been her entire world for 23 years no longer felt like home. Too much had changed, too many people were dead, and too many memories were now stained with blood. Colonel Ramirez seemed to understand something in her expression. "Where will you go?" "I don't know." "Away from here. Into the mountains. Alone, if necessary." The colonel exchanged glances with his aide, a young lieutenant who had been listening to the conversation with obvious fascination. Maria caught the look and realized they were communicating something beyond her understanding. Decisions were being made about her future without her input, and she found that she didn't like the feeling. "What if I told you there was another option?" Colonel Ramirez asked, "something between joining our forces and disappearing into the wilderness alone." "I'm listening." "There are other villages in these mountains. Other places where government forces have committed atrocities, where civilians need protection that neither we nor they can provide. What happened here today demonstrates that sometimes a single person in the right position can make all the difference." Maria felt her pulse quicken. "You're talking about making this my job, going from village to village, fighting wars." "I'm talking about preventing wars, about giving communities the ability to defend themselves so that what happened in Esperanza doesn't happen again." Colonel Ramirez gestured toward the destruction around them. "You held off 50 government soldiers for 8 hours. You killed their commander, disrupted their mission, and bought time for most of your neighbors to escape. Imagine what you could accomplish with better equipment, proper training, and intelligence support." The offer was seductive and terrifying in equal measure. Maria could picture herself moving through the mountains like a ghost, appearing wherever innocent people were threatened, disappearing before enemy reinforcements could arrive. It was a fantasy that appealed to the part of her that had discovered a talent for violence and wasn't ready to give it up. But it was also a fantasy that would separate her permanently from everything she had known before this day. Once she walked away from San Rafael, there would be no going back to helping her grandmother in the store or worrying about rice supplies. She would become something entirely different, a weapon aimed at an endless war, a person defined entirely by her willingness to kill. "What would happen to my family?" she asked. "They would be relocated to a safe area, given new identities if necessary. The government will investigate what happened here, and anyone connected to the resistance will be targeted for reprisal. Your father and brother are safer away from this place." Maria looked across the square to where Carlos and Miguel were helping injured villagers. Her father caught her eye and gave her a small nod as if he understood what she was considering and approved. Miguel, barely 18 and still recovering from his broken leg, looked at her with an expression of awe that made her uncomfortable. "How many villages?" she asked. "Dozens in this province alone. Hundreds throughout the country. The war is spreading, Maria, and civilians are always caught in the middle. You could save thousands of lives. Or, I could die in the first week. Yes, that's also possible." Maria appreciated his honesty, even as she recognized the manipulation behind it. Colonel Ramirez was offering her exactly what she wanted to hear, a chance to continue fighting while convincing herself that she was protecting innocence rather than simply indulging in violence. It was a perfect solution to the moral complexity of her situation, which meant it was probably too good to be true. "What would you get out of this arrangement?" she asked. Colonel Ramirez smiled, and for the first time he looked genuinely amused rather than carefully calculating. "Intelligence, disruption of government operations, and a legend that grows with each village you save. Never underestimate the power of story, Maria. Word of what happened here will spread through these mountains faster than wildfire. Other communities will hear that resistance is possible, but they don't have to choose between submission and annihilation. You want to make me into propaganda? I want to make you into hope." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the church entrance. One of the government soldiers who had been wounded in the earlier fighting was being carried out on a stretcher, conscious but badly injured. As the stretcher passed near Maria, the soldier's eyes fixed on her with an expression of recognition and hatred. "You," he gasped. "You're the one in the tower." Maria said nothing, but she didn't look away. The soldier was young, probably no older than herself, with a face that would have been boyishly handsome if not for the pain and rage that distorted his features. He had taken a bullet in the shoulder and another in the leg, wounds that would heal but leave permanent reminders of this day. "You killed Lieutenant Vasquez," the soldier continued, his voice growing stronger with anger. "He was a good man. He had children. He was about to execute my father," Maria replied quietly. "Your father was harboring rebels. The lieutenant was following orders. So was I." The soldiers stared at her with undisguised hatred before being carried away toward the medical station the rebels had established near the village fountain. But his words echoed in Maria's mind, forcing her to confront an aspect of her actions that she had been avoiding. She had killed men today, not faceless enemies or abstract threats, but individual human beings with names and families and stories of their own. Lieutenant Vasquez had children who would grow up without a father because of her. The helicopter crew she had shot down had been young men following orders, just like the wounded soldier who had confronted her. Even the government troops she had killed in the fighting had been people with lives and loved ones, and reasons for fighting that seemed just as valid to them as hers did to her. The realization should have horrified her, should have sent her to her knees in remorse and self-recrimination. Instead, it crystallized her understanding of what she had become and what Colonel Ramirez was offering her. She was no longer someone who could afford the luxury of moral complexity. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and her choice now was between embracing what she had become or being destroyed by it. "All right," she said to Colonel Ramirez, "but I have conditions. Name them. My family gets relocated to a place they choose, not where you think they should go. I want regular communication with them, and if anything happens to them because of my work, our arrangement ends immediately." "Agreed." "I work alone. No handlers, no partners, no oversight in the field. You provide intelligence and equipment, I decide how to use them." Colonel Ramirez hesitated. That's more independence than we usually grant to anyone." "I'm not anyone. I'm the woman who held off 2 armies in one night. Take it or leave it." The colonel's aide whispered something urgent in his ear, but Ramirez waved him off. "Agreed, with one modification. You report in regularly and accept extraction if a situation becomes untenable. I won't have you throwing your life away on a gesture." "Fair enough. What else?" "I want to choose my own targets. If you have intelligence about threatened villages, I'll listen. But I decide which ones to help and how to help them. That could complicate our strategic planning." "Your strategic planning doesn't include living in a bell tower for 8 hours while people shoot at you." "Mine does." Colonel Ramirez laughed, a sound that seemed out of place in the destroyed village square. "You have a point. Very well, you choose your own missions. Anything else?" Maria looked around at the village that had been her home, taking in the bullet holes in familiar walls, the blood stains in the dust, the faces of neighbors who had seen too much in one day. When she left this place, she would never return. San Rafael would become just another memory, another chapter in a story that was rapidly spinning beyond her control.
"I want a new rifle," she said.
Something with better range and more stopping power. That can be arranged. And a different name. Maria Santos died today. I don't know who I'm becoming, but she needs a different identity. Colonel Ramirez nodded thoughtfully. What name did you have in mind? Maria thought about it, remembering the stories her grandmother used to tell about the spirits that lived in the high mountains, the guardian beings who protected villages from dangers both human and supernatural. In those stories, the spirits were neither entirely good nor entirely evil, but something more complex and dangerous. Forces of nature that could save or destroy depending on the needs of the moment. La Sombra, she said finally. The Shadow. La Sombra it is. We'll have papers prepared within the week. Maria Santos, the shopkeeper's daughter who worried about rice supplies and helped her grandmother count change, was officially dead. In her place stood La Sombra, a woman with a rifle and a talent for violence, ready to disappear into the mountains and become something between protector and predator. As dawn broke over the peaks to the east, painting the village in shades of gold and crimson, Maria said goodbye to her family. The farewells were brief and awkward, complicated by the presence of rebel soldiers and the understanding that this separation might be permanent. Carlos embraced his daughter with tears in his eyes, whispering words of love and pride that she would carry with her into the wilderness. Miguel, still young enough to see adventure where others saw tragedy, promised to write letters that might or might not reach her. Her grandmother was the hardest goodbye. The old woman had survived wars and revolutions, droughts and earthquakes, the deaths of 2 husbands and countless friends. She understood better than anyone what Maria was choosing and what it would cost. You were always too fierce for this little village, her grandmother said quietly. I saw it in you when you were small, the way you protected the younger children from bullies, the way you never backed down from anything. I hoped the mountains would keep you safe, but I think the mountains need you more than you need them. I'll come back someday, Maria said, though they both knew it was a lie. No, you won't. But maybe that's better. The girl who might have come back isn't the woman you need to be now. Her grandmother pressed something into Maria's hand, a small silver cross that had belonged to her own grandmother, for luck. And to remember that even shadows serve the light. By the time the sun cleared the eastern peaks, Maria Santos had vanished into the high mountains, leaving behind only a legend that would grow with each retelling. The government forces would report that they had encountered fierce resistance from rebel infiltrators in San Rafael. The rebels would speak of a village girl who had held off an entire army to protect her home. The villagers would tell their grandchildren about the night when one young woman refused to surrender and saved them all. None of the stories would be entirely true, but truth was less important than meaning. In a war where civilians were always victims and heroes were always soldiers, the legend of La Sombra offered something new. The possibility that ordinary people could fight back, that communities could defend themselves, that resistance was always an option even in the darkest circumstances. Within a month, reports began filtering through the mountains of a mysterious sniper who appeared at government checkpoints and rebel strongholds alike, always targeting those who threatened innocent villagers. Sometimes, she disabled vehicles and melted away without firing a shot. Sometimes she eliminated entire patrols with surgical precision. Sometimes she simply watched from the hills, her presence enough to discourage those who might otherwise commit atrocities against defenseless communities. The government put a price on her head and sent special forces teams to hunt her. The rebels tried to recruit her and claim credit for her actions. International journalists wrote articles about the ghost sniper of the Andes. Human rights organizations debated whether her methods constituted legitimate self-defense or vigilante terrorism. But in the mountain villages where her legend grew strongest, people knew her simply as the woman who came when all other hope was lost. They told stories of her appearing on rooftops during dawn raids, of government patrols found dead with single bullet wounds to the head, of rebel commanders who decided to bypass certain villages after finding warnings written in precise bullet holes on nearby trees. Some called her a hero. Others called her a terrorist. A few called her an angel of death. But those who had lived through the night in San Rafael knew the truth. She was the woman who had refused to kneel when everyone else had surrendered, who had held her ground when retreat was the only sensible option, who had chosen to become something dangerous because safety was no longer possible. They called her insane for guarding her rifle when every reasonable person would have laid down their weapons. By morning, No enemies remained in San Rafael, and the legend of La Sombra was born in the ashes of Maria Santos's former life. The war would continue for years, spreading through the mountains like a cancer, destroying villages and families and dreams. But in the highest peaks, where the air was thin and the silence was broken only by the wind and the occasional crack of a rifle shot, one woman moved like a shadow between the worlds of the living and the dead, carrying a weapon and a purpose that would define her until the day she finally laid down her arms. Whether that day would come in victory or defeat, in old age or violent death, remained to be written. But on the morning after the night that changed everything, Maria Santos walked into the mountains as La Sombra and disappeared into legend, leaving behind only the echo of gunshots and the memory of a woman who refused to surrender, even when surrender was the only rational choice. The bell tower of San Rafael stood empty in the morning light, its stones scarred by bullets and its bell cracked by war. But carved into one of the wooden beams, invisible unless you knew where to look, were the words Maria Santos had written with her knife during the longest night of her life. "They called me insane. Maybe they were right." Below those words, etched with the same knife, was a single name: La Sombra, the shadow that had been born when Maria Santos chose to stand and fight instead of kneel and die. The legend that would outlive the war, the woman, and the village where it all began. And in the mountains where legends lived forever, that was enough.